I'm going to talk about one of the most important things you can do in watercolour really, and it's using water. And so whether you're using a big brush like this or smaller brushes, control of water is the most important thing. So pick up a small brush here. It's just a little calligraphy brush, and if you've got water on it, you can dry it on just a tea towel like I've got there. So if I dip it in the water, it's saturated pretty much all the way through. I can dry that on a towel there, and it's pretty much dry. Still a bit of water left, but if I'd use a big brush like this mop, holds a huge amount of water. You can see it just pouring out there. I can dry it on the towel. It's still fairly wet because it holds a huge amount of water, like I said. But if I just squeeze the brush through my fingers, and that gets most of the water out, and then that takes it back to not a dry brush, but a manageable amount of water. So if you struggle with that, then do squeeze it through your fingers. But I'll do some demonstrations on these 4 pieces of paper that I've got here. So I'll just move this out of the way, and I'll just go into the palette there. Just move the water pot and the little towel in just so you can see that. I'm going to use this mop brush. It's same as the large one I just had in my hand a minute ago, but it's a little bit smaller because I'm working on smaller paper. But I put that in, and that's absolutely sopping wet, and just touch it onto the towel there. But you can see it's still wet enough to loosen that paint that's in the palette. And if I just dip the very tip into the water there, you can see that's enough to loosen off that paint that was dry in the palette a second ago. And I can pick up some paint out of the well there, and that's sort of quite wet now as well. But if I just squeeze the brush through my fingers and it gets pretty much all the water out, I'll pick up some more paint straight out, and it's paint straight out of the tube, and you can see how stiff that is now. It's like very sticky paint. So if I try and paint with that, it barely even goes onto the paper. It's so sort of dry and sticky, so I really have to work the brush to get it on there. I mean, quite effective if you're looking for that dry brush dragged sort of effect. And but what I do now is I'll just put the brush back in. I cleaned it off, and I've just wiped it on the towel, and so I'll go back into that sticky paint, but the water in the brush is enough just to loosen it a bit, just to loosen it enough that the paint flows onto the paper. Now it's straight onto dry paper, and you can see it actually lightens the tone of the paint as well, so it lightens the value. And now with a wet brush, and you can see just how much that paint flows. It's obviously lightened the tone of the paint, but I could paint like that for a couple of minutes using this sort of brush, and it wouldn't run out of paint. And that makes it easy to make sort of calligraphic type marks. But I just clean the brush off again, squeeze pretty much all the water out, and just pick up some neat paint again and put that in a dry part of the palette, and just so it's really stiff again, very stiff paint. And I can drag that onto the paper. And now, so you can get some quite interesting effects now. So if I just wet the brush, dried it on the towel a little bit, and I can work back into that paint and drag that out, and I can get quite a nice little graded effect. And so I'll do that again. So just wet the brush, dried it on the towel, and just very lightly, using the tip of the brush, there's enough water in there just to tease that paint out. And another way would be to wet the paper in front of that, and then bring it into the paint, and then allow that to run back. That's another way of getting like a nice sort of soft graded edge. If you wanted to soften areas, then that's quite a nice way to do it, and quite straightforward as well. So I'll clean the brush off completely now, and it's wet, so I'm just going to wet this piece of paper just with some clean water, not completely saturated it, but just wet it enough so the paint moves. And I'll pick up some more neat paint, and I can drop that into the water now, and you can see instantly it starts spreading out and it softens. And so that's a wet in wet technique. So if you wanted to get an effect of maybe like a cloud that's soft around the edges, if you wet the paper first and drop the dry paint into it, that's quite a nice way of doing it. And another way would be to use neat paint on the brush, and then I can bring that in to the wet area, and you can see how that runs. As soon as it touches the water, it starts running into it, and it starts spreading out, and you get a sort of nice kind of graded effect. And so I just dried the brush off again, pick up more neat paint. I'm just using Payne's Grey for this at the moment. And so pick up some paint and just drag that on very thick, so it's basically straight out of the tube. And another way of getting an effect, you could use a mist bottle, and so it's very handy if you've got some areas, maybe some hard edges, you can give it a quick spritz there with the bottle, and you can see that paint instantly runs down into it. So you could quite easily get an effect of maybe like a distant rain cloud, something like that, using this. I'll just mop up that run there, I don't want that running down onto the sheet below. But it's very effective, very simple ways of manipulating the paint just by using water. I mean, obviously it's watercolour, so that clues in the name really, I suppose. But I'll do two different skies down here. I'll do a wet in wet on the left there. So I'll just wet the piece of paper all over. And again, don't want it to be absolutely soaked, because as soon as you put paint on it, it will just fall straight off of the paper basically. So it's just wet enough that the paint's going to flow. And now you might have to experiment a little bit just to get a feel for it. I mean, pretty much all of this water control does come from feel. I could talk about it all day and you probably still wouldn't get an idea unless you spent a lot of time doing it. But do persevere, because once you get it, it's kind of like a light bulb moment. And so I've just put some raw sienna down and just straight onto the wet paper. And you can see instantly that it's started to soften and sort of diffuse and move around. And if I just pick up some blue, and I'll just touch that in places as well. And because the paper's wet, there'll be no hard edges at all. And so if you want a soft sky or just any soft areas with no hard edges, then if you wet the paper first, it's a very effective way of achieving that. And I'll just pick up some of that Payne's Grey that's left up there. And I can drag some of that in as well for some darker areas in a sky. And because I'm working back into the wet paint, it's instantly softening. And I think while that's still wet on there, I'll add like a bit of distance. So I'll just squeeze out some of the paint that's in the brush, because I don't want this to completely diffuse. So I just picked up some neat cobalt blue now, and I'm just dragging that into the damp paper. And because it's slightly thicker paint, it's not spreading out as much. But because it is wet, so it's not going to form a hard edge at all. And now just drag a little bit of raw sienna down underneath that for some land. Again, it's softening. And that little bit of distant blue that I've put there is softening down and it's mixing together. And just add a little touch of foreground. But that's all going to soften nicely now. But I'll do a different technique on the right hand side here. And I will add some water in the sky. But I'll leave some areas in the middle that are still dry paper. And so just dragging a little bit of water around, but making sure that I don't completely cover the whole sheet. And I'll paint pretty much the same thing as I've just done on the left, but using these different techniques. So if I drag some raw sienna in, and now you can see, hopefully you can see in the middle there, where I didn't wet the paper, the paint hasn't covered it and it's not running down into it, so it's left some white areas behind, and these can be quite useful if you want to form some cloud shapes. So I drag some blue or a little bit of grey over the top as well. And just get a little bit of blue in there. And it's essentially the same thing as I just did on the left, but just by leaving that little bit of dry paper behind, it makes it nice and easy to get some harder edges and some sharper edges if you want to get some sort of nice sort of sharp cloud edges. It's a nice easy way of going about it. So just drop a little bit of dark in there now. Just for a little bit of cloud shadow, and I'll just rinse the brush off, and I'm just going to touch that paint there just with some clean water, and I can allow that to run down now into the water. And just soften a few of those edges in the sky. And because I've left it dry, it makes it very easy to manipulate that and work back into it. And now I can just touch a little bit of grey into that as well, so it's now kind of wet in wet. So it's a mixture of different styles. And I'll just drag a little bit of raw sienna in for some land, but because I haven't fully wet the paper, I'm getting some dry brush effect now, so I'm getting a little bit of sparkle left behind just at the bottom there, and I can use that in a minute. And so I just put in a little bit of distance now, same as I did on the left hand side, but because the sky is wet above, I can bring that up, and then that softens the top line of that, so that pushes it back off into the distance. And I'm just going to dry these, and then I'll show you a couple of things I can do with that. Okay, these are fully dry now, it's perfectly dry to the touch. And so just looking at that sky, if I wanted to get a few hard edges in it, maybe it feels like it's a bit soft, I can go back in and I can just work straight back over the top of that. As long as it's fully dry, it's quite easy just to drag a few hard edges on. And so it's kind of medium wetness in the brush. And I could do the same thing on the right hand side here. Just drag a few hard areas over the top of there. But also I could wet the paper as well, just with a mist bottle, if I wanted to soften some of that, and then work back into it and give it a little spray, and you can see that that softens. So another thing, if I just touch a little bit of paint in, just clean the brush off and just touch very gently underneath, and then allow those clouds just to run down into some clean water. It's a very effective way, similar to the little demonstrations I did above where you touch clean water and allow it to run down. But I'll clean the brush, squeeze the water out, and I'll just pick up a little bit of burnt sienna. And because the land's dry on the right hand side there, you can see that I can drag the brush across very quickly, and you get those broken lines, and that can be very effective for just for expressing, maybe there's a bit of sparkle on the water there, or little rocks in the foreground, and just by having it dry paper and sort of semi-dry paint on the brush, you can get those effects very simply. And I could also drop some dark into it just while there's still some paint there, and that will run together a little bit as well. And but the whole time just thinking about how much brush is in the water, how much water's in the brush I should say, how much water's on the paper. And you can see I just can put a very simple little boat in there, because it's dry in the sky and it's dry there, so I won't get any soft edges, so it's very easy to just put a little boat in. But now this is wet on the left hand side, because I gave it a spray, and you can see if I try and do the same thing there, because it's wet, there's not as much texture forming, it's blending together. So if I mix up some thicker paint, I can drop that in and you get a completely different effect. You can see it's slightly drier on the right hand side. I'm getting a little bit of dry brush there, but on the left hand side of that, yeah, it's very soft. So I could drop in a little tree shape as well. And there's still some moisture in the land and moisture in the sky, so that softens instantly. But the whole time just thinking about how wet the paper is, how wet the brush is, how wet the paint is, and experimenting with that. I'll show you a couple of little textural things you can get as well. I'm just using a little craft knife there, and I can scratch out some of the paint. You could use a plastic card for this, or your fingernail. I can also do this on the right hand side there. That paint's sort of very sticky, very tacky, but you can scratch out little grasses or rocks. It's a very simple way of just working back in, and just to achieve a few textural things, a little bit of effect. But it's a very simple demonstration there. So I started off just with some dry paint on dry paper, or straight out of the tube I should say, and then a wet brush with the same paint, and you can see you get different effects. And that's wet brush, wet paint, and I could work that paint very easily, and then putting some dry paint down, running water into it, just softening the edges. And then over here, similar thing, and then using the mist bottle as well, just to get some runs and different effects happening. And then wet sky on the left there, and then just leaving some drier areas and working around that leaves you a few hard edges, and you can get the dry brush sparkle. And so always thinking about water, how much water you got in the sky, how much water you got in the land, and then just working with it, drying areas off. You can always work back into it, especially if it's wet. You can always add more layers, but it's always something to think about. But practice is key. Constantly practicing, constantly looking at the effects that are made, and then working with them, making adjustments on the fly as well. There's a demonstration over on my Patreon at the moment where I demonstrate Edward Seago techniques for skies, so like layering, so that would involve various different layers and then drying it off and adding layers on over top of that. So check that out if you're interested in Seago's watercolours. I'll be back again next week with another video, so do subscribe if you haven't already, and comment on this video, let me know what you think. So anyway, I'll be back again next week, so until then, happy painting, and I'll see you in the next one.